I hope you are all doing well. Welcome to another thrilling reality-based story on Cursed Ink Tales. If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel yet, then do it right now. And don't forget to press the bell icon so you stay updated with all our upcoming videos. A fisherman named Syracuse is casting his nets into the water when, suddenly, he pulls up his net and finds that he has caught a woman's body. Upon closer inspection, he realizes that the woman is alive. He removes her from the net and gives her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to bring her back to consciousness, helping to clear all the water from her lungs. He tells her that she's alive, but she doesn't believe it. She says she thought she was completely dead. Syracuse gives her a blanket to keep warm and says he will take her to the hospital. However, she doesn't like the idea and says she's fine. Syracuse insists that after such an incident, she should definitely see a professional, but she says she can't meet anyone. Another boat passes by, and she crouches down to avoid being seen by the people on board. Syracuse asks her name, but she replies that she doesn't remember. Syracuse guesses that she might have hit her head and lost her memory. He introduces himself saying his name is Syracuse, though people call him Circus to suggest he's a clown. He realizes she doesn't want to be seen and leaves her in his late mother's secluded cabin. He gives her his lunch and asks if she'll be all right alone, as he has some work to do. She says she'll be fine, which surprises him, but he leaves from there. In the next scene, Syracuse arrives at his ex-wife's house to take his daughter, Annie, for dialysis. She is disabled and he carries her in his arms. He asks her if anything strange or beautiful happened to her recently, and she questions why he always asks that. He says that he always hopes something strange or beautiful will happen. During dialysis, Annie asks him to tell her a story, and he begins telling her about a fisherman who caught a woman in his net. She asks him what kind of creature the woman was, but he doesn't understand what she means. She asks if the woman was a mermaid or a selkie, and he replies that he can't say for sure. Then, Syracuse buys an automatic wheelchair for Annie so she can move around more easily. He brings her back home, and his ex-wife informs him that Annie needs a kidney transplant, but the doctor says they haven't found a match yet. Syracuse returns to the mysterious woman and is surprised to find her still there. She asks him why he's surprised, and he replies that he half believed this was all just a dream. Syracuse takes his boat out for fishing, and the woman asks if she can join him. He hesitates, saying it's considered bad luck to bring a woman on a fishing boat, but then changes his mind and lets her come along. As usual, he struggles to catch anything. He asks if she remembers her name, and she replies that he can call her Ondine. When he asks what it means, she explains that it's the name of a woman who came from the sea. She begins singing a haunting, beautiful song in an unfamiliar language, and as she sings, Syracuse pulls up his cage to find he's caught several lobsters. He finds this strange. He sets another cage, but it comes up empty. He asks Ondine to sing again, and as she does, he lowers the cage and, upon pulling it up, discovers he's caught even more lobsters. He feels that she's bringing him good luck. Syracuse then teaches her how to bind the lobster's claws. Ondine asks if he usually catches this many lobsters, and he replies that it almost never happens. Later, Syracuse says he'll head into town to sell the lobsters, and that Ondine will get a share for her singing. Ondine declines to go with him, explaining she doesn't want people to see her. He points out that he's seen her, but she responds that only he is allowed to see her. Syracuse makes some money by selling the lobsters, and buys a dress for Ondine. He also steals some women's underwear. He then goes to Annie's school to meet her and continues telling her the story he was narrating during dialysis. He says that the mysterious woman from the sea sings in a strange language, attracting all the lobsters to make it easy for the fishermen to catch them. Annie speculates that she must be a selkie, a mythical creature who is half woman and half seal, and when they come to land, they remove their seal coats. She explains that the woman's song is actually a way for her to communicate with other sea creatures. Annie then asks Syracuse who the fisherman in the story is, and Syracuse admits that it's him. He's making up the story for her. She doesn't quite believe him and secretly follows him when he leaves in his car. Syracuse arrives at his mother's house and finds Ondine trying on his mother's old shoes. She doesn't even know how to tie the laces, which he finds odd. He gives her the dress he bought and she kisses him as a thank you. He asks her how long she plans to stay, and she says it depends on him. He replies that if it's up to him, she can stay forever. Meanwhile, Annie is secretly watching everything unfold. She decides to read more about selkies to better understand what might be happening. Syracuse goes to a church and confesses his sins. He tells the priest that he's an alcoholic who has been sober for 2 years, but his ex-wife still drinks, and he wants to gain custody of his daughter to keep her safe. The priest suggests that he could arrange for both of them to meet with a counselor, but Syracuse declines. He also confesses that he stole some women's underwear, and the priest responds, saying he doesn't like where this is going. Syracuse assures him that it's not what he thinks and starts telling him about Ondine. The priest asks more questions, but Syracuse doesn't reveal where he's keeping her. The priest then asks Syracuse to keep him informed about any new developments in this situation. Ondine puts on the underwear, but then decides she won't wear any when she goes swimming. As she comes out of the water, Annie is there waiting. Annie says she knew her dad didn't make up the story incorrectly, and that Ondine really is a selkie. Ondine realizes that Annie is Syracuse's daughter. Annie asks Ondine if she has magical powers and if she can heal her. Ondine asks what's wrong, and Annie explains that she has kidney failure. Annie notices that Ondine feels cold, and she explains it's because selkies retain their power in the water. Ondine replies that she doesn't understand what Annie is talking about, but Annie insists she has done all the research, so it's better they don't lie to each other. Annie explains that selkies can stay on land for 7 years if they bury their seal coats, and during this time, they will shed 7 tears. Afterward, they can achieve extraordinary happiness with a landsman. As Annie begins to leave, Ondine kisses her and says she'll wait to see her again. Annie feels a slight dampness on her cheek, realizing that Ondine has shed one of her 7 tears. Meanwhile, Syracuse goes to the library to check out books on selkies, only to find that Annie has already checked them all out. Syracuse then offers to take Ondine fishing again. She agrees, but only if he promises that only he will see her. He makes the promise. While they are fishing, the fisherman patrol passes by, and Ondine ducks down to hide. She uses her feet to steer the boat, which amuses Syracuse, as fishermen have their own quirky habits. Ondine begins singing again, and Syracuse unexpectedly catches a large number of salmon. He is surprised because he was trawling, which isn't the usual method for catching salmon. Typically, a gill net is used for that. The fisherman patrol officers board Syracuse's boat to inspect how he managed to catch so many salmon by trawling. They check his gill net to see if it's wet, and during the inspection, they spot Ondine hiding. they mention that there's a woman on board, and Syracuse asks if that's illegal. They reply that it isn't illegal, but it is unusual. They leave, but Ondine realizes that they will likely talk about what they've seen, so there's no point in hiding anymore. Syracuse arrives in town with Ondine, and everyone stares at her. He explains that it's a small town, and a girl as beautiful as her is rarely seen. He takes her shopping, and a crowd gathers outside while she tries on new clothes. Meanwhile, Syracuse and Annie talk about how he found Ondine near Seal Rock, which makes sense if she really is a selkie. In the next scene, Annie and Ondine are at the old house. When Annie mentions that she doesn't know how to swim, Ondine decides to teach her. While teaching her in the water, Ondine suddenly sees something and quickly pulls Annie out. Then she dives in and retrieves the object. Annie asks if it's her seal coat, and Ondine immediately says yes, suggesting they should bury it so she can stay on land for 7 years. Annie likes the idea. Together, they bury the mysterious object, and Ondine makes Annie promise not to tell anyone where it is hidden. After that, Annie, Ondine, and Syracuse head out to the sea, where Annie explains to Syracuse that Ondine can stay with a landsman for 7 years unless her selkie husband comes to take her back. She also mentions that selkies can grant people's wishes. Ondine tells Annie to stop because she's not a selkie. Meanwhile, a suspicious, dark-haired man arrives in town, looking for someone specific. Annie decides to test Ondine's claim that she isn't a selkie by jumping into the water. Ondine immediately dives in after her and saves her, which only strengthens Annie's belief. Later, Syracuse takes Annie back home, where her mother informs him that a dark-haired man is in town looking for Ondine. But he isn't using that name. Syracuse and Ondine reach home, and she asks him why people call him Circus the Clown. He explains that he used to drink heavily and do foolish things. She then asks what made him stop, and he tells her that one day he came home to find Annie unconscious while her mother had passed out from drinking. He decided that one of them needed to stay sober to care for Annie, but his wife threw him out. Since he's just a fisherman, the authorities didn't grant him custody of Annie. After this somber story, Syracuse and Ondine grow closer and lose themselves in love. In the next scene, Syracuse goes to the church again to confess his fears. He tells the priest that he's scared because Ondine is bringing him good fortune, and he started hoping again, but he also fears that this might lead to something either very good or very bad. Outside the church, the dark-haired man is waiting for Syracuse and asks him what he calls the woman he pulled from the sea. Syracuse refuses to answer. In the next scene, Ondine is asleep when she sees headlights outside the house. Realizing it's the same dark-haired man, she quickly hides, filled with fear. Meanwhile, after Annie's dialysis appointment, Syracuse takes her to her mother's house, only to find it locked. The keys are with his ex-wife, who's at a bar, leaving Syracuse no choice but to keep Annie with him, though he's reluctant. When he arrives home, he finds everything in disarray. Worried about Ondine, he goes out to search for her and eventually finds her hiding. He asks her what happened, and she tells him that the selkie husband Annie mentioned has come to take her back. Syracuse suggests she tell him to go to hell, but Ondine says it's not that simple. Syracuse jokingly suggests that if Ondine can grant wishes, she should wish for the dark-haired man to leave. Instead, Ondine wishes that Annie would no longer be sick. In turn, Syracuse wishes that Ondine would stay with him forever. Meanwhile, Annie's mother, who is drunk, is driving Annie home when she crashes into another car, which belongs to the dark-haired man. Her boyfriend, Alex, is thrown through the windshield and dies in the accident. Syracuse and Ondine arrive at the accident scene, and Syracuse rushes to check on his daughter. At the hospital, the doctor informs him that Alex had a donor card, and surprisingly, he's a tissue match for Annie. They begin the transplant process. Meanwhile, Ondine encounters the dark-haired man, and their conversation reveals that both are involved in some illegal activity. Syracuse attends Alex's funeral, pushing his ex-wife's wheelchair. At the wake, his ex-wife insists he have a drink in Alex's honor. Syracuse hesitates but eventually gives in to the temptation. She then says that as long as she's in a wheelchair, Annie should stay with her, but Ondine must go. She believes Ondine brought good luck at first, but it always ends in disaster. Syracuse, overwhelmed, drinks an entire bottle. Intoxicated, he takes Ondine to Seal Rock, sits her there, and pretends he's going back to the boat for another bottle, but he's actually leaving her alone, intending to abandon her. Ondine pleads for a chance to say goodbye to Annie, but Syracuse ignores her. He tells her that people like them can't be together, and that she should stay there and sing for the seals. In the next scene, Syracuse is found sitting up in a tree, where the priest comes to help him down. The priest tells him that he has a hard time accepting good fortune. The priest tells Syracuse that it's easy to stay sad, but finding happiness requires effort. Inspired, Syracuse goes to the hospital to pick up Annie and brings her home. Annie asks where Ondine is, and Syracuse tells her that Ondine's selkie husband came to take her away. Annie insists that she'll come back because she left something important behind. When Syracuse asks what, Annie refuses to say. Later, Annie is watching TV when a concert by a band comes on. Syracuse recognizes the song. It's the same one Ondine sang on his boat. He realizes it's a real song, meaning Ondine is a real person, not a selkie. He rushes to find her and locates her at Seal Rock. He demands she tell him the truth. Ondine finally reveals her secret. She is a prisoner and drug mule from Romania. The dark-haired man, Vladik, was with her when they were caught by the Irish Coast Guard. Vladik forced her to carry the drugs and swim to escape. Although she's a strong swimmer, the Irish waves nearly drowned her, until Syracuse saved her. Syracuse asks her real name, and she tells him it's Joanna. In the next scene, Joanna and Syracuse return home, only to find that Vladik is already there, waiting for them. Vladik and his accomplice threaten to shoot Syracuse and Annie if Joanna doesn't reveal the location of the drugs. Joanna takes them to the spot where she buried the drugs, but they aren't there. Annie then reveals that she had hidden Joanna's seal coat, the stash, because she didn't want Joanna to be found and forced to leave. Joanna promises Annie that she'll stay if she reveals the location. Annie admits that she hid it in a lobster pot. They all go to the boat, and as Vladik hauls up the lobster pot, Joanna uses a rope to push Vladik and his accomplice overboard, where they drown since neither can swim. Later, the police arrive and take Joanna into custody, while Syracuse and Annie return home. In the next scene, Syracuse returns to the church for confession. He tells the priest that Joanna is due to appear before a judge next week, and since she's a foreign national, she'll be deported. However, if she becomes a citizen, she can stay. But for that to happen, someone would need to marry her. The priest smiles, hinting at who that someone might be. In the following scene, Annie helps Joanna put on a wedding dress, while Syracuse arrives dressed in a fancy suit. The three board a boat and head to the wedding ceremony. The townspeople watch as Syracuse kisses his beautiful sea-bound bride-to-be. The end.